And with that, I'm going to hand the baton over to our panelists, building quality in, so real world quality by design implementation stories. So have a great session, guys, and carry on.
Thank you, and thank you, Kim. And there was actually a question for you. What's your favorite series at the moment? I figured it was important to ask you before we moved on.
Well, I'm watching right now. Well, for me, The Office would be, thank you for asking. Office would be something that I really, really love. But right now, a series called All Her Fault, and I really, really like that. And I think people should check it out. It's a lot of twists.
Amazing. All right. Thank you for that. Okay. So welcome everybody to the third session of the day. So we're going to be talking about everything QbD and trying to sort of get some real world insights into how our panelists have been able to work with QbD approaches in their day to day. So before we get started, I'm going to introduce the panelists. So we have three very experienced panelists for you today. The first is Sean Hastings from PharmXL. Sean is Director of QA, and his experience is really spanning over 2 decades working in pharmas, CROs, and a phase 1 investigator site, covering all aspects of quality across all phases of research and across many therapeutic areas. His focus has been on SOPs, training, audits, including internal audits and service providers, inspection readiness and hosting, process improvements and quality metrics. Sean holds an MSc in Scientific Research and Development from Cranfield University. So welcome, Sean. Next up, we have Frank Hendrickman, who is with Qfinity Quality Management. He's the Senior Executive Consultant. Frank has a lot of experience in quality management, validation, and compliance. So he's been working for over 25 years in the pharma industry, including roles at ParXL and Bayer. He co-authored ISPE's GAMP Good Practice Guide, validation and compliance of computerized systems, computerized GCP systems, and that's important distinction there, and data, and contributed to the GAMP 5 second edition. He's an ISPE member since 2001, and he's a certified GAMP trainer. So welcome, Frank. I'm sure you're going to give us some interesting insights, especially maybe from the GMP side of things as well. And then finally, we have Christy Mazzarisi from Network Partners Group. So Christy is the Principal Consultant, Quality and Manufacturing. She has over 18 years of industry experience as Head of Quality and a Quality Systems Professional. Christy is most passionate about continuous improvement activities and consistently building quality into every area of the life sciences. Her background spans pharmaceutical and laboratory sciences, R&D and commercial manufacturing, GMP and GLP, leading to strategic management of major programs such as gap analysis and transformation of product quality systems, SOP transformation and optimization, QMS frameworks, and operational systems audits. Basically the full gamut. So again, welcome, Christy, to the panel. I'm sure that you're going to have a lot of really interesting insights in terms of how we can leverage QbD to really build quality into our processes. So I do have a few questions to get us started in our discussions. And then, of course, for the audience, if you do have questions, please post them into the Q&A tab. I will monitor them and we'll aim to put those questions to the panel as well. So let's get started with maybe just some initial experiences with implementing QbD within organizations. So can any of you sort of talk about any of the experiences you've had in implementing QbD and you know, what were the key success factors? You know, how did it go? What worked well? What didn't work so well? Who would like to go first?
Sean, you start.
Shall I jump in first?
Yeah.
We don't all really eager there to jump a bit and get going, get in. So Yeah, thanks for the great introduction there, Paul. So yeah, for the audience listening today, so fundamentally my background is on the GCP elements. So I've worked a lot of the times with project managers, CRAs, yeah, TMF resource managers, etc. In my time in this industry, and I think basically for quality by design, I think the main success factor has actually been the kind of the uptake. I know that risk management was something that was introduced in E6R2 a little bit more formally, as we know, with that new section that was added back then. And so, yeah, I would say briefly, that's probably been the success factor, is that was introduced. I think a lot of people kind of got on board with that and kind of embraced it a little bit. But I think on the downside of that, they then felt that it was a lot more work for them to do, having to create these extra documents and almost having to slow down a little bit when they're trying to, especially from the clinic ops perspective, right? Trying to speed up and get that first patient in when you're telling them to slow down a little bit. So yeah, that's definitely my view, and I'll pass over to the others.
So listening to what you were saying, Sean, and my experience, so I'm mostly on the GMP side of things, right? So that's kind of the hat I wear a little bit, and compliance. But looking at this with a clinical lens, and the time that I've done it, I would say some of the key success factors that I saw were really around the people piece. So the mindset shifting of QbD, how to think a little differently, right? And how to gain early stakeholder engagement. That to me was one of the biggest pieces, is to get that buy-in, make the team kind of understand what is QbD and what does that mean, and how do we have to think differently. And also, of course, you talk about all these extra documents, right? In the designing your risk controls and having clear documentation. That is all obviously a part of that. But I think the people piece also was the biggest challenge for me. That's been kind of both.
Yeah, I totally agree with that one. The people piece is absolutely critical. I look at things more from a technology compliance side, as I'm the computerized system validation guy in this panel. But the acceptance of a risk-based approach was fairly easy to establish, but then making people actually think along those quality by design principles and making efficient use of their risk assessment and thereby gaining also some efficiencies or better quality is still a challenge as of today. What I'm seeing, at least in the technology side of things a lot, is we are spending days doing risk assessments, going through all the functionalities of systems, and then afterwards we test them all the same, right? So there is not really a risk-based approach in it. We are doing the risk assessment because that's the expectation by the regulators and or the customers. But when it comes down to actually making the tough decisions, like this is low risk and we are doing a lighter approach or a non-test approach on certain areas, that is where the whole thing quite often falls apart in numerous companies. Because it's like, oh, no, we can't do no test, or no documentation. That would be simply impossible.
As you're talking, I mean, there are several things coming in my mind. I think the first thing that, as you were saying, Frank, people spend days putting together these risk assessments and then they don't properly leverage them anyway. It's almost as if we need to do a risk assessment on the risk assessment to actually identify what at a high level, what are the really high risk areas that we should be focusing on, and then let's do our risk assessment on those areas first, so that we can really sort of capture the possible risks and then mitigation for those high risk areas. And then the other thing that I'm sort of thinking about is there's performing a risk assessment and building in quality by design principles into our processes for a particular study based on the critical quality factors. But then there's also maybe a lot of work that could be done upstream within our processes and within our standard plans and our SOPs to already go through that exercise, so that when you get to a particular study, you're not having to think of everything. You're really just thinking about, well, what are the specific risks that this particular study design presents, so that you can really focus that. Because I think you're right that risk. I think first of all, QbD is not always that clear what it means to everybody. People have heard of it, they've heard the term, but they don't quite understand what it means and the different pieces. And then I also think that people can get quite overwhelmed quite quickly with risk assessments, and also they tend to go down a lot of rabbit holes as well. And so it's not an easy thing to do. It really isn't. And so I think that we have to kind of think about how can we break it down into maybe smaller pieces to make it more practical and more implementable.
And I think another challenge that I just wanted to add was, I think that the risk assessment and risk is quite subjective as well. So definitely when you are going to an organization where they've never really created these risk assessment templates or these SOPs before, and it gets kind of put on someone's shoulders, they're sitting there thinking, oh my gosh, where do I start? And as you say, that's then when they start going down that rabbit hole, because they're wanting to create a template or a plan, like Frank was sort of talking about, where it's all encompassing and it sort of gives all the options, all the risks, so that when people come to use it, there's less thinking involved. But as you say, that can then take months or even years to kind of sometimes get those templates up and running as well. So I think that can be definitely one of the challenges. Yeah,
it also takes time to build that confidence that you can actually do it that way. That you can apply a risk assessment to justify your approach, rather than trying to go for everything at the same level, right? Because it always feels like you are neglecting certain areas, and there are always some people that think these areas are super important or super risky or whatever, so making these tough decisions and not getting hung up in too many what ifs is critical. I mean, I've been working with a lot of folks that were going like, oh, if this happens, then this might happen, and this might happen, and this might happen, and ultimately this might kill a patient. But if there is like 15 what ifs in between, there is no real risk, But sometimes it's hard to get that thought across, especially if companies or organizations are starting on the QbD principles and the risk assessments.
And I think to touch on what you said, Frank, too, is like a lot of this you can't really do in a silo, a risk assessment, right? You should have all the right stakeholders in the room to be able to flesh out, the biases or the unconscious biases we may have as we're going through the different risks. What I try to do is get everybody focused on prevention over detection. So how do we go from reactive to proactive and kind of redirect the conversation as I typically facilitate risk assessments, and as the facilitator is just keeping everybody, everybody's mindset in the right focus and try not to detract from the different levels of risk.
Yeah, you said something super important, Christy, which is getting everybody at the table. You need to break up the silos. One of the things that I've been doing over the past years over and over and over again is trying to make sure that, for instance, the validation and the technical people are talking to the clinical trial people, the study team people, and vice versa. Only if the study team can explain what are the really important data, what are the endpoints, we can detect what systems are really involved and where should we focus our testing as well. Because the techies, they don't have the medical or the clinical expertise to make such assessments. For them, it's all the same, So having this interface between the operational part of the study conduct and the backbone of the technology that supports it all the time, and having these people talk to each other and make them understand each other is fun, and has been for the past years in my life.
Yeah, and I think that principle applies not just in relation to computerized systems. I think it also applies to the way that we're conducting the study and clinical operations, making sure that they're talking with regulatory and they're talking with data management, and that everybody's speaking the same language and participating. I think also having the right facilitator is key. And Christy, you mentioned that you kind of facilitate this quite often, because I think one thing that happens a lot in organizations is we have like a template. And Louise, somebody in the audience mentioned this, she said, like, isn't also the issue we try to standardize the template rather than look at the individual study and its environment. And I think that happens a lot. We have like the risk assessment template, and there's already a bunch of risks that are just very generic, right? That have been listed, and people just accept them as is, and they, you know, their whole point is, well, we need to get a document that QA is going to be able to approve. But yeah, how much critical thinking has gone into it, I'm not so sure. You know, so having the facilitator who can be there to sort of bring everybody around the table, you know, together, and actually help them through the process of properly identifying what truly is risky within this study design, and how can we then start to break that down so that we can clearly identify those risks and mitigations so that we can avoid them. I think that's it's definitely a key role, and it's quite a skill set too, because just trying to keep everybody on the same page is not always that easy either, right? So
it's not for the weak.
Yeah, not for the weak of heart. For sure.
So how do you
said,
sort of manage that, Christy, when you have people that just don't agree? You know, like how do you mitigate that?
Yeah, sometimes it takes a little bit of a sidebar conversation to explain the why behind certain things. But just having a really good facilitator that has really no, I would say, attachment to the study is usually typically very helpful. Then you're not seen as, oh, well, you play this role, so of course you're going to feel this way, right? So try and get that outsider view. And usually somebody in quality tends to play that role, at least from what I've seen. It does take somebody who can really be a true partner, right? Quality has to be seen as that partner when going through these processes. Otherwise, it can be, you know, seen as a little bit of policing, and we don't want that. So that's kind of important.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I think that's where, you know, ICH E6R3 is kind of redefining the playing field a little bit, where it requires quality to be there at the beginning and to be that partner, right? And help the teams put in place, you know, the quality by design and identify the critical to quality processes and build that quality in. So I think it's definitely a game changer. But you're right, it's going to take time for people to evolve. And even, you know, taking a risk-based approach to the way that we execute our processes and making sure that we can build in quality can also be challenging, because people, you know, they've been doing the same thing for the last 20 years. So getting them to change their process is also difficult. And as Frank said, you know, sometimes some people will find something to be extremely important, you know, and very high risk, whereas others will be like, well, no, it's not so important. Or if we change the process in this way, it becomes less important. So yeah, it's definitely a big challenge, the human element.
That's And what I was going to say is, you need to find what is in it for them. That's
Right.
And that's the human element, as you say, and the people element, and that subjective element as well. So, you know, as you say, they just want to sit down, do a risk assessment, and get it signed off by QA, and it's a piece of paper that they think will get filed away and never looked at again. Little do they know they'll have to look at it again. But it's that people element about what's in it for them, and what's the benefit for them as well. And it's getting people to realize that and recognize that there are benefits, and not lose sight of the ultimate goal. You know, this isn't just like with all documents we put in place, it's not just a piece of paper just that will end up in the TMF or wherever. You know, there is a reason and a cause for it. So I think that's also an important part of building that relationship and that culture, especially being a QA person with, say, clinical operations or other operations who are putting these risk assessments in place.
Absolutely. So you mentioned something important there, Sean. So you said that it's not the last time you're going to look at it, because effectively we should be doing sort of continuous evaluation of risk and continuous improvement and continuous readjustment, right? So how do you go about putting that in place, and what are the sort of the key ingredients you need to ensure that teams are continuously looking at the risks and revisiting things to make sure that we're sort of taking a risk-based approach to everything we're doing?
So I'm happy. maybe to share from my experience and then get the other two to chip in. But I think fundamentally from my experience, it's about making sure that the review or the risk assessment is a common topic or common agenda item in your project review meetings. Again, I'm talking from GCP ClinOps areas here in fundamentally. So making sure that's there, making sure it's discussed, and has there been anything that would impact or need for the risk assessment to be looked at? You know, a lot of the time you might get a new protocol amendment, you might have a new kind of IMPD for the drug, etc., that might actually change some of those risks, or it might not. And so it's important to make sure it's front and center, as you say, on those routine kind of meetings to have those conversations.
Yeah, and I think, at least from a technical validation point of view, doing the reviews on a periodic basis is not that big of a deal, but it certainly at some point degrades into a checkbox exercise. And that is, from my point of view, a significant risk. The other piece that is even a bigger risk from my point of view is you're doing your risk assessments, you're designing certain controls, you implement them, but you never check whether those controls are really effective, right?
Yeah.
Do they achieve what you wanted them to achieve? Because that basically means you need to go back and look at all of these things and have KPIs or metrics defined that would enable you to give a decent evaluation or do a decent evaluation of these controls that you have put in place. You have as a control, such and such will be addressed in training because it cannot be solved by any technical or other means. So do we ever go back and then check, is that training effective, or are people consistently doing the wrong thing and the control is actually not very good? You know, that is where I see still a lot of improvement in the QbD implementation part. Let's put it that way.
See, I think in the GMP space a little bit, the effectiveness piece I feel like is a little more solid than in the clinical space. Still, there's still a lot of that gray area and a lot of subjectivity on it, depending on who you're talking to. But, you know, from what my experience has been is we see, at least in the quality space, a risk assessment as a living document. It should be dynamic. And like you said, you know, we can't continuously bring it up and then it become just a checkbox, right? We got to make sure that everyone understand how important it is, why we're doing what we're doing, why we're going over certain things. And part of it is going back and checking, did this work? You know, did the mitigations we put in place actually do what they were supposed to do, right? And have that discussion at least at some type of periodic basis. Or if something pops up, let's go back and check our risk assessment. What did it say and what did we do? And let's take a look at that effectiveness. And I think that's something I'm still seeing in the clinical space with some of the clients that I'm with. They're still not there yet and don't see that as an important piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think
I just wanted to add maybe one challenge as well while we're talking about that topic, and we're talking about the people part and we're talking about revisions and things like that I've faced is turnover of staff. So as you say, Frank, you know, there's periodic times that these risk assessments are reviewed. There's certain trigger points that you'll have, trigger documents that trigger the risk assessment review. And I've had times when project managers have joined the company and they've had to now do a revision to an original risk assessment, and they didn't get effective training when they joined the company on the actual risk assessment at the time, for example, for that study. So now they're coming and trying to review and revise this risk assessment, having not created the original. And that can be quite an interesting discussion. You almost sort of have to go back to a little bit of a square one, kind of re-engage that project manager, for example, in my examples, and you know, get them on board with it and get them to understand it. So I think that's something, a takeaway for anyone listening on this is also make sure that when you're doing handovers or bringing new staff on, that those kind of risk assessments that are put around quality by design are part of that sort of induction training, and to make sure that they kind of understand what they're going into.
Yeah. And one of the most important pieces from my point of view in a risk assessment is also to write down why you consider a risk to be high or low. Just saying, oh, it's high, it's medium, it's low, and then designing some appropriate control for it is only half of the work. You need to put down in writing your thinking behind it, your thought processes, because otherwise If the one guy then gets to Barbados because he has won the lottery, the next guy who needs to take over will feel like he's run over by a truck. And it will be impossible for him to actually defend in any discussion why something is high or low unless it's super obvious.
Yeah. The other thing I think.
Part.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
No, you go ahead. I'll speak out to you.
No, I was just saying that I stress the justification piece, right? The documenting exactly why we're saying this is high, meaning why we're doing what we're doing and why we're putting this mitigation in place. I stress that completely. And that's one of the things, I typically won't sign off on something unless I see a solid justification, because again, like you said, Frank, someone can win the lottery and off they go, right? And then we don't see them ever again. So we have to be able to defend that risk assessment at the end of the day. So how do we do that if it's not properly documented?
Yeah, I think
that's also in the latest regulations. If you are looking at the computer system assurance documentation that has been finally published in its final version recently by the FDA, they are all about putting down in the risk assessment why certain things are risky or not risky, not just the fact that it is or is not.
No, I think it's key. And the other thing that's sort of popping into my mind is, as you go through a risk assessment exercise, quite often there can be drift in your thinking. So when you start, you're doing your first few risks that you've identified, and that one's high, that one's medium, that one's low. But then your criteria can evolve over time, and your perceptions can evolve over time. And so that's where I think having justification is really useful to bring people back down to where they should be, back down to earth, and ensure consistency across the risk assessment. I think that's really, really key. One thing you mentioned, Frank, was metrics. And I think metrics are obviously super important to give us indicators and feedback on things that are happening within the trial and enable us to evaluate the effectiveness of our risk mitigation strategies, or allow us to potentially identify risks that we hadn't previously identified, or risks that are actually occurring in the study. Now, when you think about a clinical trial, there are so many different stakeholders and processes. It's quite difficult to come up with a really super comprehensive dashboard with all of the different metrics, which will give you an insight into all of the different functional areas, right, of a clinical trial. And obviously, you can delegate somewhat to each of the different functional areas to come up with their own metrics, but how consistent is that going to be? Not so sure. The thing that's coming to my mind is, can we leverage AI as a solution to this? Can we start to use AI to say, okay, take a look at this risk assessment, and then take a look at my data and take a look at my TMF, and tell me, are you seeing any of these risks materialize? And are there other risks that I may not have thought about that you're also seeing in the data that we have? Is that something that you guys have started to think about?
Absolutely. But I take it even a step further. I can see AI helping us driving consistency through risk assessments and identify gaps like no metrics, KPI or critical to quality aspect defined, et cetera, so that it will first of all help us getting to better risk assessments that are more consistent and more easily to review. And then it will most likely depend on how are the data generated that basically are the forming the basis for these metrics. I'm sure there can be a lot of stuff automated and then being made available. But at the minute, what I'm seeing in that area is in its infancy. Everybody's talking these days about the large language models and what ChatGPT can do for us. But AI is so much more, right? It's there are dozens of other models that can juggle numbers and compare things and identify trends or clusters or whatever. We barely scratched the surface on that one. And I see great potential in that area to make our lives a lot easier and our trials a lot safer in the next couple of years.
Yeah. I have tons on AI, but I'm sure you guys do too. So I'm all ears.
I was going to say, kind of some of the things, as a consultant, I'm seeing different companies, small to large, doing different things. And the hot topic, especially over the last 6 months or so, has been in AI initiatives at these different companies, whether it's on the manufacturing floor for their clinical trials, even just in the compliance area, right? How can we utilize AI better, and what are other companies doing? That's been the big question. And most of the time, nobody's actually leveraging it appropriately. Like Frank said, we're barely scratching the surface. There's so much we could be doing, and it's how do we start, right? Where do we start? I think every company is going to be a little different with how that works, but it could be a really powerful enabler of quality by design when it can support predicting and preventing risks, right? That could possibly impact our trial outcomes. And to me, that's something we need to really dive a bit deeper in and try to utilize better across our systems, not just in the clinical space.
Yeah, and I wanted to add from my perspective as well. I think one of the concerns, in particular using kind of the publicly available AI platforms, let's say, is obviously intellectual property. So, uploading your clinical trial protocol into say ChatGPT, etc., then makes it available to that system, and everyone else could actually find that information at some point. So guidance I've been asking people to use when they're thinking about these sort of risk assessments is to put general comments in to these chat systems and see kind of what they're bringing back, these AI systems. So saying stuff like, what could be common risk identified from a phase 1, clinical trial run in X disease, and answer, put that question in, kind of see what it comes back. So kind of testing the waters with your sort of specific but generic questions, if that makes sense. Because I think, as Frank says, we're still in their infancy there.
Yeah, I agree. I think that making sure that we have a proper framework to properly control the flow of data that we're giving AI is super important. And then also making sure that we have the proper framework to promote responsible use. So not just sort of taking what the AI tells you as gospel, right? We need to have critical thinking. We need to have human in the loop. And it should just be a tool, as you said, Sean, like you can ask it stuff, but you need to evaluate what it's saying. So making sure that we have that in place, I think, super important. But I do think that it can be useful for, if you've identified, for example, a particular risk, you could even ask, well, what would you do to mitigate this? Or, what critical control factors are at play here, and what kind of controls can I put in place? Sorry, critical quality factors, and what controls could I put in place, just to get a second opinion almost. And I think it's interesting. But I think further along, we can start to leverage AI as well to start to be able to calculate risks in a much more structured way. Obviously, risk assessments take into account so many different factors, and there's initial risk assessment, and then there's the ongoing risk assessment as we conduct the study. And if we can feed data in a very secure manner to the AI agents that can run on it, then it can start to give us insights into things that are maybe not going quite as they should. And it can give us patterns and signals, which can trigger us to go and evaluate our risk assessment that we did and maybe adjust it. I think that's where the true value comes in, but it's going to take some time, and of course, training, right? It only knows what we tell it, kind of thing. So it's important to leverage it properly.
Yeah, and I've seen something out of the corner of my eye in the chat. Oliver has been putting there that an AI should be run and hosted locally so that you can prevent the intellectual property going places, which is absolutely true, but probably not very feasible in a lot of cases for smaller companies, because there is a significant investment involved. Everybody pretends like AI, it's for free because nobody needs to pay for ChatGPT when it's being used privately. But building such capabilities within your own organization to prevent that intellectual property becomes part of the public domain is a significant investment in IT and knowledge and etc. So I think it's equally important to have a policy saying these are the tools that you can actually use, or you should use these tools in such and such a way to prevent loss of intellectual property, because it will not be possible for everybody to work with local AI tools, at least for the large language models.
So we do have some questions from the audience. I want to try and include some. So one question from Anonymous, I'm not sure who this is, but are there any common risk assessment activities or QA activities that you think will go away or change completely with AI tools assisting QA in the future, and why? Any thoughts?
I don't think that anything will truly go away. It will just become a hell of a lot more efficient. Because the risk assessments, we are not doing risk assessments for the benefit of doing risk assessments. We are doing risk assessments to achieve something. Therefore, we are building them into the processes at the appropriate times during change control, during the initial creation and design activities for clinical trials, et cetera, et cetera. So these will stay, but they will become much more efficient and much more assisted by AI.
Yeah, I wanted to add a perspective about assisting QA in the future. I think one thing that I've been training people on and for using AI is audit checklists. So there's a great way of putting kind of an audit checklist together using AI. Obviously, you have to add your own views, but it helps you to make sure you don't forget. So if you go into ChatGPT and you say, create an audit checklist for auditing a clinical trial master file, you'll be interested to see what it kind of throws back at you. And so I think definitely it will help things, as Frank says, become more efficient, more quicker, and also maybe fill some of those little gaps that some of us do have in our knowledge on certain bits that we might have otherwise not looked at.
There is one aspect that I would like to add here, because it talks about QA activities as well. From my point of view, it's critically important for QA to become familiar with what AI tools can actually do for them. So I've been working with a lot of QA organizations that are super conservative. It's within the industry. We are a conservative industry, and QA is probably the most conservative part in our industry. So they actually need to get familiar with the AI tools. They need to be open-minded with regards to how can we use them, how can we utilize their power in order to become more efficient. I truly believe that AI will help remove the often perceived bottleneck of QA within approval processes and review processes.
Yeah,
I think, also to that, Frank, we're still also trying to balance innovation and compliance from a quality perspective. And that's probably where some of that conservative, feeling comes from. Understanding AI tools and how those align with GXP principles, I think, is something that we all need a little bit more education on. That could be helpful to take maybe a more risk-based approach and really get comfortable using AI and the different, avenues we have to do that. Actually, one of the things I did with my team a couple of years back was I gave them all a month, and I asked them to come up with one way AI could help their job become more efficient and faster. But still compliant. So we kind of did a little exercise, and it was interesting. Most of it was around, like Sean, you mentioned the audit checklist. Most of it was around helping develop, templates and documents and things like that was the outcome. But it was a neat little exercise to kind of let everyone be a little autonomous and go off on their own and play, right? And then see what they could come back with.
Yeah, I like that. I think we have done some similar exercises in our organization as well. And I think it's interesting to get people's perspective on these things, because as we said at the beginning, it is all about the people. It's not just about the AI. So we are going to have to bring our session to a close. So I'd like to thank everybody, all of our panelists for providing such great insight, some really interesting topics and really interesting feedback. and experiences. I'd also like to thank the audience. Unfortunately, we couldn't get to all of your questions, but I'd like to thank you for participating.